So how do you win hearts and minds? We weren't able to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. We aren't able to win hearts and minds now in the Middle East. How do you win hearts and minds? Well, first you have to admit the fact that people have hearts and minds, right? So you can't dehumanize them. And I think we have to look at the masters of winning hearts and minds. Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhi was more tactically and strategically brilliant than any general I've ever studied. Gandhi was more tactically and strategically brilliant than Alexander the Great, Hannibal, or Napoleon. And think about it. Gandhi was able to defeat the most powerful empire on earth, the British Empire, without firing a single bullet. Even more impressive, Gandhi was able to transform his enemy into a friend. I think if Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War, would have been alive and able to witness Gandhi, he would have been in awe because Gandhi thought tactically and strategically. Gandhi had been a soldier in the army and had served in the Boer and Zulu wars, and Gandhi used militaristic language. He called his supporters an army of peace, and he called his methods the most powerful weapon. Gandhi even said that if he had to choose between violence and not fighting due to cowardice, that he would rather choose violence and cowardice. But that he had found a better tactical and strategic way to solve a problem than violence, and that was waging peace. So I was able to study waging war and waging peace, and I was able to compare and contrast the two. And what I found is that violence has no creative power. Violence can't build anything. Violence can't create anything. The only thing that violence can do is tear down. So just as waging war tears down, we must wage peace in order to create and build. The second thing I learned to change my life is the idea of waging peace. What does that term mean, waging peace? What does that mean? Yes.
Well, it's more than something you look at.
Right.
It's something you do actively in 1,000 ways.
Exactly. It's action, right? It's like Howard Zinn said. Howard Zinn said, between war and apathy, there are 1,000 possibilities. And that's waging peace. And what are examples of waging peace in history?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King Jr.? What else?
Vietnam protests.
Vietnam protests? What else? What are other examples?
Egypt.
Egypt? Good.
Surrounding the Pentagon with a ribbon. You don't remember that.
Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Women's Rights Movement, even Mother Teresa, Greg Mortensen, Albert Schweitzer.
Poland, before the wall came down.
Exactly. A lot of examples in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So let's talk about a couple of misconceptions, because our lives have dramatically been impacted by waging peace in ways that we're not really taught. So let's talk about a couple of misconceptions. How are the slaves in America freed? How are the slaves in America freed?
By the president?
Did he free all the slaves or just?
Just the southern ones.
Yeah, just the southern ones. Now, the Civil War, it kept the country together, it kept the Union together, but did the Civil War free the slaves, or did the Civil Rights Movement free the slaves? I mean, if things were so hunky-dory after the Civil War, why were a lot of African Americans wanting to have a violent uprising against the American government? It actually took a peaceful movement before African Americans got their human rights. It took a peaceful movement to change people's attitudes that gave African Americans their human rights. And how many European countries had a war to free the slaves? 0. Not a single European country had a war to free the slaves. So let's look at another misconception. What did the Founding Fathers talk about? No taxation without representation. What does that mean, no taxation without representation? Remember?
And then boycotts.
Do what?
Boycotts.
I mean, what does that mean, no taxation without representation? What does that mean? Remember from elementary school history? Remember what that motto meant? No taxation without representation. It means you can't tax me unless you give me a vote. Can't tax me unless you give me a vote. Can't tell me what to do unless you give me some sort of vote or say or participation. And that's why they were built. But up until the 1820s and 1830s, 50 years after the Revolutionary War, less than 10% of the American population could vote. Women couldn't vote, African Americans couldn't vote, Hispanic people couldn't vote, Native Americans couldn't vote, white people couldn't vote unless they owned land. So did the white non-landowners fight a war to get the right to vote? Did the women fight a war to get the right to vote? All done through peaceful means. Have any of you read The Art of War by Sun Tzu? Sun Tzu is probably the most famous and brilliant military thinker in history, and what do you think Sun Tzu would have thought of Gandhi? Well, here's a quote from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu said, Winning 100 victories and 100 battles is not the pinnacle of excellence. Defeating your opponent without bloodshed is the pinnacle of excellence. So Gandhi, who defeated his opponent without using violence, was the pinnacle of excellence. To better understand what waging peace really means, let's talk about the 5 kinds of war. Sun Tzu and the other ancient Chinese military theorists who were heavily influenced by Lao Tzu listed 5 kinds of war from best to worst. 5 kinds of war from best to worst. So what's the best kind of war, according to Sun Tzu in the East? What's the best kind of war?
Meaning the war without battle.
The war that is better than that is the war that is never fought. The war that is never even fought. What's the second best kind of war? Even better than that is the war that is avoided. So the best kind of war is the war that is never fought. Second best kind of war is the war that is avoided. What's the third best kind of war? War without bloodshed. The fourth best kind of war is the war with casualties. And the fifth best kind of war, or in other words, the worst kind of war, is the war that keeps escalating, the war that never ends. An example is the conflict between Israel and Palestine and the U.S. war on terrorism, the way we're fighting it now, right now. So the first 3 best kinds of war: the war that is never fought, the war that is avoided, the war without bloodshed. Are they the same or are they different? They sound similar, but are they the same or are they different? They're different. We'll talk about why. Let's talk about the best kind of war, the war that is never fought. War that is never fought. Have any of you heard of Jet Li? Any of you heard of Jet Li? Okay. I once saw an interview with the martial artist Jet Li, and Jet Li said, "I have the #1 martial arts self-defense technique." The audience was on the edge of their seats, wanting to hear this ancient secret, when Jet Li said, "The #1 martial arts self-defense technique is you smile at people." Because if you smile and are nice to people, they usually don't want to fight you. And then Jet Li said, anyone who gets in a lot of fights has very poor martial arts self-defense. When waging peace is concerned, that involves relating to people in a way so that they don't want to fight you, and having a relationship between countries so that they don't consider going to war with each other. Let's talk about the second best kind of war, the war that is avoided. When you are engaged in a hostile confrontation, that involves talking your way out of a dangerous situation and resolving conflict peacefully. If somebody wants to fight you in the street, that involves dialogue. When a situation is hostile between countries, that involves diplomacy. Let's talk about the third best kind of war, the war without bloodshed. War without bloodshed. Any of you watch mixed martial arts? No. Any of you heard of mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu? Okay. If somebody attacks you in the street, jiu-jitsu teaches you to take the person's limb and apply so much pressure to the joint that their limb will break if they do not give up. Jiu-jitsu doesn't teach you to kill, but it does teach you to break bones as a last resort. And don't underestimate Gandhi. Gandhi broke bones as a last resort, metaphorically speaking. Martin Luther King Jr. said Gandhi broke the backbone of the British Empire. What does that mean? When waging peace is concerned, the bone you are trying to break as a last resort is your opponent's economy. During the civil rights movement, the intention of a boycott was to apply so much economic pressure that your opponent would rather give up than continue to suffer economically. Jiu-jitsu teaches you to make a person give up by applying a chokehold, and in a similar way, Gandhi tried to strangle the British economy. But this is never done with bad intentions. This is never done with bad intentions. Gandhi brought the British Empire to their knees. Gandhi brought the British Empire to their knees. But when he forced them to leave India, he said, "We never wanted to bring you to your knees, we just wanted to bring you to your senses." I used to think that waging peace was the opposite of or the negation of warfare, but waging peace is warfare. It's not warfare against people, it's warfare against greed, ignorance, oppression, injustice, hatred. It's warfare against all those things that hold people hostage.